Hello, everyone. This is the 195th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I interview Polish football expert Mr. Christopher Lash and freelance football writer Mr. Ryan Hubbard as we discuss the matches of the Poland national team during the 1982 World Cup. Mr. Lash is a Polish writer, blogger, podcaster, and university lecturer at Warsaw's Lazarski University. Mr. Hubbard is a freelance football writer, artist, and broadcaster, and is based in Leicester, in England. He writes about Polish football to an English speaking audience. Mr. Hubbard is also the author of From Partition to Solidarity, the first 100 years of Polish football. And this was published in 2019. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you for
Good
having
to,
me.
good to be here. Good to be here, Sean.
Mr. Lash has been on a podcast a number of times. So, Mr. Hubbard, can you introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
Yeah, so as you've mentioned, I'm Ryan Hubbard. I've written about Polish football on and off for must be about 14, 15 years now. Yeah, with a heavy focus on the history of the game. As you mentioned, I'm the author of the book From Partition to Solidarity, which details the history of the first 100 years of Polish football, right from the early days to the turn or to the fall of communism. And yeah, I've been writing about football in Poland for quite a while, trying to push to an English audience and try and make it accessible to an English audience for as long as possible, similar to Christopher.
Yeah, we have a lot of crossover, but we'll do our best to sort of hop in and out here, I think, and sort of hopefully provide some nice insights.
Last time in our discussion, Chris, we left off at the 1978 World Cup. Can you summarize Poland national team's trajectory in the post 1978 era up to the year 1982?
So Gmach ended things, everything ended up pretty badly with Gmach in 1978. And then they appointed Ryszard Kulesza to be the coach. And Kulesza was a very different kind of character to Gmach. Gmach was very ambitious, kind of had his very clear sort of position on many things and wasn't a very, let's say, I'm using a big word here, a lugubrious kind of person, someone who was nice with people. And Kulesza was complete opposite, very, very pleasant. Everyone liked him. A little bit like Górski, a little bit in that regard. Obviously a bit young. Well, I think he was 50 when he was appointed or something around there. And he still had a good host of players, right? Obviously Boniek in a fantastic time in his career and all this kind of thing. So really good in that regard. They were not able to qualify for the 1980 Euros, even though they beat the Dutch in one game and I think drew in the other. But that was obviously a period of time when it was really difficult to qualify for the Euros, right, Ryan? Yeah.
Yeah, I think you got to mention as well that they lost a lot of players during that period, specifically after the 78 World Cup. The likes of Dana effectively moved to Man City and effectively withdrew from the national team because of it. Kasperczak, I think, moved to France. Tomaszewski, he moved to Belgium, and at that point of time, there were no foreign-based players in the Polish national team. So by moving abroad to get their money and retire handsomely, that effectively withdrew them from consideration from the national team. As you mentioned about Kulesza being a completely different character to Gmach, I'm not sure how much you're aware of it, Chris, but at the similar time, you had there was a lot of upheaval within the PZPN as well. So you had, I think it was the same day. Well, no, sorry, it was in about October of 78 where you had the general secretary for the PZPN, Zbigniew Ból, and you had a month later, it was the president of the PZPN, Edward Schneider, who both were killed. One of them died in a bus accident, one of them died in a car accident. So it wasn't just a period of upheaval for the Polish national team, it was within the structures of the PZPN as well. There were a lot of changes there, and it was a similar time to when Kulesza was brought on board. So the PZPN appointed a guy called Marian Ryba, and he was an army general who obviously was, again, he was the complete antithesis of Kulesza. Kulesza was, someone who was very well liked, and you had his boss, Marian Ryba, who was this stern, big guy who had a big authority. But I think one thing to say with both of that is it was clearly a period of upheaval for everybody. So at that time, everybody was at least pulling they were all pulling in the same direction.
It's difficult, and I think, Sean, you're going to come to it later, but it's difficult to really talk about that entire period really without talking about the incident that happened at the airport, which is sort of like one of the biggest scandals in Polish football history.
There's also a few stories within that Euro 80 qualifying campaign as well that sort of will lead into where we're going. That was an unsuccessful qualifying campaign, as you said. You talked about they played against the Netherlands. They had East Germany in the group as well, the neighbours from East Germany, which is at the time that's a massive game for Poland. And there was a lot of controversy in those games as well. The game in Leipzig against East Germany in particular is one that's sort of talked about, and the fact that the Polish team believed they were poisoned at halftime or poisoned before the game. There was a lot of distrust of the East Germans, and there's been a lot of talk and rumours about doping within the East German game at the time. And there was a lot of conspiracy around that particular game, thinking, Poland were 1-0 up at half time and not exactly cruising, but winning, and ended up in the second half conceding twice. And there's talk of players feeling sick after the game and not feeling great. And that put effectively Poland in that poor position. And then you also had the game against the Netherlands as well, which was the final game where Poland really had to win and ended up drawing 1-1, which effectively, although it put them top of the group, it effectively ruled them out because East Germany had to play against the Netherlands and one of them would eventually sneak above Poland. But there was a lot of controversy around the players and the journalists on that trip. And there was a lot of the journalists had been writing very negatively about the Polish players. And there was this whole thing about the players calling the journalists dogs and derogatory comments made toward them. And that ended up in some slight suspensions for some key players, such as Lato, I think was one of them, Boniek, Terlecki, I think Szymanowski was another one. So there was a lot going on in the background as well at the same time there that eventually will lead on to some things later on as well.
Yeah, exactly. Builds up to the scandal, because that clearly... there wasn't a good relationship between well, it often isn't, but there wasn't a very good relationship at all between the press and the players. And that also came out quite strongly after the incident we'll talk about later. But there were still some decent players around. I mean, Terlecki will we'll talk about him as well later with the incident. It's difficult not to talk about the incident because it's such a kind of like an all-encompassing
It's all hush-hush at the moment.
Yeah, but we will talk about but Terlecki's an incredibly talented player. I mean, lots of problems with, off the pitch, a bit of a strange character in many ways. A really, really exciting player, very skillful, great left foot. And he didn't make the World Cup for the thing we're going to talk about later. In 82, if he had gone, he would have been, actually 26 or 7 at the time. So we're going to go talk to it about later, but Poland were not that super entertaining at the tournament. And I think with Terlecki in there, would have been maybe a bit more like 74, even though they obviously did very well at the tournament in 82.
Right. Yeah. Well, speaking of 74, there were still a number of remnants from that team. Zmuda, Lato, Jarmach, and Marek Kusto. So what was their status now in the Polish game as we enter this new decade?
Well, I think Lato and Jarmach in particular, we're getting to the period around 1980, towards the middle of 1980. Those two both reached their 30s. And 30 in Poland, I think you may have discussed it on previous episodes, but it's a big age in Polish football in that it allows them to move abroad, go and find foreign clubs. So Jarmach, he went to Auxerre in France. You had Lato went off to Lokeren in Belgium to join Włodzimierz Lubański. So effectively, at the turn of 1980 into the summer of 1980, they were no longer part of the national team. You had Władysław Szmuda, who you mentioned. He was just about to move to Widzew, I believe, at that point. And this is a Widzew team who had, I think, finished second in the league twice. So he's becoming a key player within that national team, within that Polish football as a whole. And you mentioned Kusto as well. Kusto's a strange figure in the sense that although he'd been to the previous 2 World Cups, he hadn't played a game. He'd been around the squad, but he wasn't really a big name in Polish football compared to some of the others. And I think at this point, he's sort of a middling, he's a decent player for Legia, but he's not one of the standout performers in Polish football.
Yeah, I just keep talk about Telecki, but we go back. The point is, he was one of the most exciting newish kind of players coming through. But then, it all comes down, and obviously we'll talk about it later. It comes back to Boniek being this just everything. Obviously, Smolarek is an really important player coming through, who obviously was not, let's say, superbly technically gifted, but was someone who worked very hard, like Boniek, and worked well with Boniek in general. So I think that talking about Smolarek's emergence, I think is an important one. Yeah, Lato and Sharmak. I mean, Sharmak was never a quick player, really. But obviously Lato, his whole game was about pace. And obviously by 82, well, we'll come back to it. I mean, Lato still did some great things at the tournament. But he is a very different player to what he was as a speed demon in 1974.
And you already mentioned Boniek. And clearly by this point, the most important personality in the Polish game was Zbigniew Boniek. And we discussed him before in the 1978 World Cup as he's emerging. So at this point, he's on his way to Juventus for the 1982-83 season. Can you put in perspective his importance in the Polish and the European football as a whole at this point?
I'm just going to sum it up, really, in the fact that we've just mentioned that 30 was the big age in Poland for moving abroad. It shows his importance to, I suppose, Polish football in the fact that the Polish Football Association effectively changed the rules for Boniek. Mm-hmm. At this point, going into the 82 World Cup, he's 27, just about to turn 28, I think. So he's still 2 years away from being able to make that transfer. But because of his saleability, because of his value, and the fact that he had English clubs sniffing around him, Manchester United, I think, were interested at one point. Ipswich were interested, I believe, after they played against Widzew Łódź in late 1980. But yeah, the fact that the Polish FA, it was at a general meeting that, decided to lower that age to 28 was purely for the fact that they could make such significant money off of Boniek that they decided to change those rules.
Yeah, you have to look at the overall context as well. I mean, this is in the early 1980s, which we'll obviously come back to later. Poland was not in a, I'm being very diplomatic here, was in not a very good economic situation. So literally anything that they could sell, they would. And Boniek, I don't know the precise details of it, but it was linked. Obviously, Agnelli was still probably the family, still the owners of Juventus, was prepared to also give additional stuff related to the transfer, which the Polish state, being someone who not only was in a huge financial crisis, but also really was, especially after 1981, after December 1981, was really incredibly isolated on the world stage. So anything that they could do to get anything into the country, and therefore that impacted the transfer as well, I think, a lot.
We've previously mentioned about the likes of Jerzy Gorgon retiring from international football, Kazimierz Dejna retiring from international football. There's a bit of a vacuum there as well. And Boniek was always the one who was going to fill that, just with his personality. He became effectively the de facto leader of the national team in 78. He probably had, especially during Kulesza's short reign, probably as much say in the running of the team as Kulesza probably did himself.
Yeah, and they say the same thing about him during the 82 World Cup, right? It's a bit like, I suppose in modern day terms, even though I'm sort of losing track a little bit, it's a bit like Ronaldo being the coach of Portugal sort of thing. A lot of journalists have said that basically he was making the decisions, the tactical decisions, because the 82 World Cup team, even though it did have some good players, and I think it's important to underline it, it really was, in my opinion, not as good as the 74 team, which had just a really lots of breaking through stars at the same time. So therefore,
I generally agree with you there, Chris. I completely agree with that.
Yeah. So Boniek's position was a bit more important within the team. It's a little bit like Lewandowski in today's Poland national team. It's that there's no Piszczek anymore. There's no Kuba. So his opinion, it's more difficult when there's loads of stars for one person's opinion to be the most important. But in that 82 team, it was a bit different. Boniek was clearly the star.
You already mentioned some names like Smolarek or Teleti. Which other players had been the significant additions post 1978 in frame for the 1982 side?
Teletsky after Smolarek. Anyone else? You go for it, Ryan. You go for it after that, because
I think there was a lot of underrated ones in the team. I think Matishik, for example, who came in during the qualification campaign as opposed to before 1980. Pavel Yanas, really, who's not had a mention, especially with Jerzy Gorgon retiring. He filled that void.
Winarczyk as well.
Winarczyk, yeah, of course.
The goalkeeper is very good goalkeeper. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was mid 1980 where he sort of emerged, sort of claimed that number one position for his own. So yeah, there's a handful of players, and also a handful of fringe players. Really, well, there were a lot of fringe players. Like you said, that team probably doesn't have as much depth as the '74 team, but there are a lot of players, the likes of who were decent players, but perhaps not. They weren't really household names and weren't really great players. The likes of Andrzej Pałasz, Andrzej Bunsol. He was a decent player.
Yes,
I'm just trying to think who else there was.
But Bunsol,
Likes of Janusz Kucewicz.
I mean, Kucewicz was actually a very talented player for the Polish league. I'm not sure internationally that. I mean, Matishik was amazing because he just really worked hard, right?
Yeah,
Bunsol,
hard worker.
Exactly. Wasn't there a story about him fainting or nearly fainting on the pitch because he just really did what the coach, was Piechniczek, told him to do. Bunsol also hard worker. So it's kind of like Boniek, brilliant. Teletsky, who didn't go very good, and Smolarek, hard worker. It's sort of balanced in some respects, but then you've got this superstar there, Boniek, who was just head and shoulders above everyone else, I think. A lot of the players were decent players, basically. But if I was a Poland fan in 82, would I have been excited by most of those players? Not really. Not really. No.
Let's get to that incident that we've been hinting at.
Finally.
Yeah. So the year
Get the popcorn.
Yeah. The year 1980-81 was turbulent off the field. The December 1980 World Cup qualifier at Malta had many ramifications that included an eventual managerial change. Can you discuss these few months that could have derailed Poland's World Cup plans?
We've been itching to talk about this bit, obviously.
You start and I'll add some details maybe at times. Go on, you go for it, Ryan.
So, yeah, the first qualifying game of the campaign, Kulesh's, I think it'll be his first competitive match in... Oh, no, sorry, it won't be his first competitive match in charge. Obviously, he was during the 80 campaign. First qualification game, heading away to Malta. The Polish season's just started its mid-season break. The Widzew Łódź players are, I think, just returning from a UEFA Cup game against Ipswich. And they're all convening in Warsaw to fly off to Rome for a week in Rome, of a bit of training and a bit of acclimatization, and then making a hop over to Malta for the qualification game. There's been a lot of rumours about what exactly happened. The main one that comes out is it's Smolarek and Józef Winarczyk, who allegedly don't like the food in the hotel, is one of the excuses that they've always said. But they decide to leave the hotel and go for a few drinks in the centre of Warsaw. Kulesza, we previously mentioned he's a bit of a nice guy. He's a bit of perhaps a soft touch. He's actually apparently at home at his apartment in Warsaw, allegedly, according to what I've heard, trying to convince Grzegorz Lato to join the team from Belgium without any idea as to his form or how he's been playing in Belgium. So he's completely away from the squad, leaving the squad to their own devices. And we've got two players out on the town, meeting up with one of Winarczyk's friends, a journalist, at a bit of a nightclub. And before we know it, it's 5 o'clock in the morning, and Winarczyk is stumbling back to the hotel, heavily intoxicated, according to reports, allegedly. I want to throw that in there. And gets caught by the team coaches and is effectively told that he's not going to be travelling to the game in Italy.
There are different versions, right? A lot of them. I mean, there's this
many different versions.
There's a weird version which is that Winarczyk's friend, the journalist, his wife was sleeping around a lot and that
So
escaped
yeah,
to Italy.
Yeah, she escaped to Italy. Widzew Łódź, who Młynarczyk played for at the time, they had obviously, I just mentioned that they just played against Ipswich, but in the round previously they'd beaten Juventus, and there was some sort of talk that perhaps he was trying to find out to see if he'd heard any information while he was over there, or if she tried to be in touch with any of the players. As you said, it's apparently his ex-wife was a lady who was apparently well known around Warsaw. Is how it was put. And yeah, apparently he was trying to get information from Młynarczyk about his ex-wife.
So he was feeding him alcohol, basically, getting him to drink as much as possible. So yeah, Lash was giving them a lot of freedom. He's not staying in a hotel with the players. And I thought the version was that Młynarczyk wasn't allowed on the bus to the airport. And I think that's when
correct.
The coaches
Yes.
stepped in. Yeah. And then what they did, and this is the controversial element, this is where Terlecki comes in. Terlecki, who had a Lada, and at that point it was difficult in Poland to buy cars. So he was able to do it because he was a footballer. He got ahead in the queue. And he basically took Młynarczyk to the airport in his Lada because Młynarczyk wasn't allowed on the team bus or team coach. And so they get to the airport and Polish television journalist filming. He was supposed to do some just kind of cover thing, how is it? What's it like? What do you feel like as you go off to fly to Italy and stuff? And then it just turns into this completely chaotic situation with Młynarczyk being carried in, basically, this big guy, sort of being carried in or helped to walk into the building by Terlecki, who was a lot smaller than him.
By all accounts, it hadn't really been noticed, even though he was obviously clearly not in a fit state. The thing that kicks it off is Terlecki and his idea that the journalists filming the team are going to pick up on it. So by all reports, he decides to run around the airport and pull out all the plug sockets of the TV cameras so that they can't record, and effectively turns what could have perhaps been a minor disagreement into this big blown out scandal.
Yeah, and then Boniek and the other Widzew players came in actually even before they got before Młynarczyk wasn't allowed onto the coach, they had been saying, he should come. They were standing in his defense, Żmuda and Boniek, and Smolarek a little bit, but not as much.
A little bit.
Right? Yeah. And so when they get to the airport, obviously after this whole big thing happens with Terlecki making something which was already, he could have dealt with it discreetly, he didn't. Then Boniek and everyone else came in, well, not everyone else, but 2 or 3 Widzew players came in to defend Młynarczyk. And yeah, eventually Młynarczyk got on the plane, even though he was not supposed to. So they fly off to Italy, right?
Obviously for a bit of training. I think they had I think it's a sort of a bit of a friendly match against, I think it was Perugia or someone of that ilk. Going back a couple of years, one thing we haven't mentioned at all is that in Rome, in the Vatican, they elected a Polish Pope. Now, that obviously caused a lot of waves in the Polish government, who are very, I suppose, can we say anti-religion, Chris? Can we? You're, I suppose, more the history expert.
I would say they were very uncomfortable. It put them in a really uncomfortable situation because the Polish population, even though obviously communism is officially atheist, right, were very religious and people still going to church. A lot of party members also got married in church and stuff at this time. So they really couldn't attack the Pope. So they're in a really uncomfortable position.
At some point, I've heard stories that it was a Polish guy living in Rome or living in Italy who had connections and managed to basically arrange an audience with the Pope, with the Polish national team, which, as Chris mentioned, it was very uncomfortable for the Polish government and the Workers' Party in Poland to see the Polish national team, fraternizing with the head of the Catholic Church.
It's solidarity. You've got Terlecki and those guys causing such a scene and meeting up with the Polish Pope. Symbolically, the optics are not very good, let's say.
After causing all of that chaos, I think it's at this point where we have Marian Ryba, the head of the Polish FA, who we previously mentioned, not traveling with the team, I think, due to a bit of illness. I think he would have traveled with the team, but he stayed back in Warsaw. who gets on the next flight out to Rome to effectively come and collect what is seen as the Banda Czworga, the four offenders from the airport incident. Józef Młynarczyk, Zbigniew Boniek, Władysław Żmuda, and of course, Chris's favourite man, Stanisław Terlecki. He flies out to Rome to basically bring the four players back to Warsaw in shame and basically have them as scapegoats for the whole incident.
Like I was saying before, because it was at this very specific period of time in Polish history, right? August 1980 is the signing of the famous Solidarity Agreement, right? Lech Wałęsa with his big pen. I think it was then he signed it with the big pen. Anyway, that's an extra thing. And then, so we have this situation, and you have this clear parallel, right? Because you have the Polish society standing up for their rights, right? And first independent trade union, all that stuff. And then at the same time, you have these players, right? Also, and the Polish government treating Solidarity like troublemakers, right? And then at the same time, you have these Polish players who were really troublemakers, let's be honest. They're being treated by the press as this kind of, not just a scapegoat, as in like, let's blame this whole situation on them, but let's link it to the overall situation. This is what happens to people who do not follow the laws of the Polish People's Republic, right? So it's a way of, there's a real almost one-to-one link between the two things, right? I mean, it's unavoidable.
In the end, all four were suspended, and as a result, the Polish manager Kurzela resigned, and it's at this point that Antoni Piękniczek is appointed in the spring of 1981.
There was the whole case, the hearing back in Warsaw. So the rest of the Polish team obviously carried on to Malta, won the game 2-0. Under a bit, it was an abandoned match because the players were being pelted with stones, and it was effectively abandoned with 10 minutes left of the game. But Poland picked up the 2-0 win. But yeah, returned to Warsaw to this big hearing where effectively the four players were suspended. Smolarek was given a tiny little punishment as well. And yeah, Piękniczek is brought in as the new coach. So you've got Piękniczek, who he'd just been appointed as manager of Ruch Chorzów as well, I think only a few weeks prior to this. So Ruch Chorzów is his home team, his club he played for many years. He'd finally been appointed as coach of his boyhood club. And within a month, he's been appointed as the national team coach without even leading Ruch into a game. Piękniczek's ascent was a very quick one, I think, really. He was manager of Odra Opole before and brought them up into the Polish top flight and did really well with them. Obviously moved on to Ruch, who are one of the biggest historical clubs in Poland, and yeah, was snatched away. He's a sort of in-between figure. So he had a good rapport with the players, but he did have that bit more of a sternness that Kulesza perhaps didn't have. Sort of somewhere in the middle, I suppose, of Kulesza and Gmoch.
So somewhere in the middle. Obviously, Silesia is this, as Ryan obviously has links like in Górnik and all this kind of stuff, but it's famous, this work ethic, right? It's a bit like the northwest of England. I suppose it's other parts of the north in England as well, including Leicester probably, but this kind of idea of hard guys working hard, being kind of focused, and Piękniczek, not incredibly charismatic person, a bit stern, but not like full of himself like Gmoch. Gmoch thought he was the bee's knees, as we say. Kulesza was a sweet guy, and Piękniczek had very, very clear values, kind of person who wanted them to run a lot. Don't think he was a particularly modern coach that much, but I think it was a good appointment. I don't know how the players welcomed him initially. Maybe Ryan knows a bit more, but actually, obviously later on, there's a lot of discussion about Piękniczek's relationship with Boniek, but I'm not sure how initially they got on. I don't know if you found about that, Ryan, when you were doing your research, or
not so much. I think by all accounts, there's a lot of respect. I think Boniek, he can be very respectful of certain coaches, perhaps, and perhaps not all coaches. I think he was very respectful of Kulesza, but perhaps for different reasons, perhaps for giving them that freedom and perhaps allowing them that ability to rebel. But I think with Piękniczek, it was very much, like you say, the work ethic, and he knew what he was leading the team into, and the team knew what he was leading them towards and what the target was. And And there was just that clear definition of this is what I want my team to do sort of thing. So I think there was a lot of respect from that angle. But obviously that, I'm sure we'll go on to at some point soon, obviously that didn't stop Boniek from being Boniek. And like you say, perhaps having a bit more say within team matters than he probably should have done.
Do you know what led to the lifting of the suspensions in the fall of 1981?
Effectively, it was the fact that the Polish national team needed those certain players, or three of them at least. We've mentioned Marian Ryba, the president of the PZPN. Even according to interviews in his later life, he believed that the team needed those players as well. But being the one who ultimately led to the suspension, he resigned from his position as head of the Polish FA. Because according to I think in his words, he couldn't be the one to bring them back into the Polish national team. Pietnicek pushed. Władysław Żmuda was the first one, I think, to come back into the national team. And he was back in the national team for the game against East Germany in, I think it was May. Boniek and Młynarczyk had their sentences reduced, but they weren't available until much later in the year. So this game, another one I find fascinating, again, going back to the Euro 80 qualification against East Germany, this was the one where they claimed they were poisoned. This time, Poland head to East Germany with all their own food, with all their own water, with their own chef, people on alert, making sure that nobody from East Germany comes anywhere near the team to avoid any risk of there being any sort of poisoning or anything like that. And Poland win the game. So Poland are all of a sudden head of the group and things looking absolutely rosy again.
In Trozo on May 2nd, Poland wins 1-0 with a Bunchal goal.
Sorry, it's the Chorzów one. Sorry, it's the Chorzów one is first, yes. So this is the one, they win that game, and then the second game, that's the one Boniek and Młynarczyk are back. This is the one where they take their own food and water.
Yeah, in Leipzig.
And this is effectively the big game of the qualification campaign because they've got Malta last game. It's almost a certain win. So it's all about this game in Leipzig. Take their own food and come away with that important 3-2 victory.
I mean, it's also weird looking at the group, right? 3 teams. And one of them's Malta. I mean, who, let's face it, have never done very much, have they?
I think every other group in that qualification campaign had 5 teams, and 2 teams were guaranteed to get to the World Cup or at least got to a playoff or of some sort. But this was a 3-team group with only 1 team qualifying for the World Cup, which probably made things much harder for Poland. Then against the neighbours again. These players described these games against the likes of East Germany and particularly the Soviet Union as they were wars. They weren't games, they were wars. They meant everything to the people. They were a win over your neighbours was a massive propaganda thing almost. Even for I suppose the government, it was almost like things have to be cordial. We have to show respect for our socialist brothers and all that stuff. But almost it was it proves our brand of socialism better than your brand of socialism, that sort of thing.
Official friends, but it's friends that invaded them.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a bit different than playing against the Czechs, the Czechoslovakians, although Poland and Czechoslovakia, Poland did also invade Czechoslovakia in 1938. But let's not talk about that too much. But the point is, anyway, they had to beat the East Germans and they did it. So that's the most important thing. Yeah.
We have to mention as well that these games, we finally saw a foreign-based Polish player. So this is particularly without the 4 suspended players for the first game. We saw the reintroduction of Andrzej Szomach. We saw the reintroduction of Grzegorz Lato, who were the first Polish players to play for the Polish national team whilst playing for a team outside of Poland. So that was a big deal.
Oh, I didn't even think about that. Is that really the first time?
Yeah. Well, yeah, because I'm not sure. Well, you had Lubanski during the 78. Yeah. But effectively, this was the first time where they were brought back in. And I think Lubanski there was an element of for what he'd done for Polish football because he didn't really get much game time at the 78 World Cup. It was the fact that he missed the 74 World Cup and he was a big name. He wasn't necessarily brought on for the fact that because of where he was, his stature or his ability in Polish football at the time.
There are exceptions, certainly. I mean, it might not be the first time, but they're making an exception to get these guys in, for sure, definitely.
And the second game against East Germany, that's where we've got Tomaszewski as well. Tomaszewski played in the first one. Tomaszewski played in the second one as well. Well, he was certainly brought into the squad for the second one. under the proviso that he would be the starting goalkeeper for that game. But in the background, you've got Pietnicek working to secure Młynarczyk's early release from his suspension. Tomaszewski turns up to the game expecting to play, and Pietnicek chooses Młynarczyk ahead of him. Tomaszewski, who's travelled from, I think he's playing for Hercules Alicante in Spain at the time. So he's travelled all this way to Poland to effectively sit on the bench, which after that game, he turns around and he says, I think Pietnicek comes and says, we've secured our qualification. There's 17 or 18 players in this dressing room. You're all going to the World Cup. And at that point, Tomaszewski turns around, obviously severely angry at his situation, and says, it's not for me. We've got a friendly game in Łódź in a few weeks against Spain. I'll play it for that one, but that will be my farewell, and I won't be travelling to the World Cup.
Młynarczyk was a better goalkeeper by that time, really. And also, I mean, okay, he did drink a lot that night, but in general, less of a problematic. That was a really big moment of problems, right? But in general, not someone, Młynarczyk isn't someone like Tomaszewski who was constantly talking and either encouraging or irritating people. Młynarczyk, not that kind of a person. So at that point, it probably was the right decision from Pietnicek, I think. I mean, Tomaszewski was a very good keeper, but then he was declining.
We already also hinted at the solidarity movement. Let's remind everyone that we are still living in the Cold War era. And around those years, there's the emergence of Lech Walesa and the solidarity movement. And this is important in terms of football because when we come to the World Cup and the match against the Soviet Union, that would be in the news. Can you explain the solidarity movement to anyone who might not know about it?
It's a big question. So basically, Poland it depends, different definitions about whether they were occupied or just the satellite state of the Soviet Union. Solidarity there's sort of oppositionary movements in the 70s, I think called the Committee to the Defense of the Workers in 1976. And it sort of as a kind of a groundswell, it's building up the opposition. And then it all kind of emerges out in the open in the summer of 1980 when you have these strikes at the Gdansk shipyards. And this is the moment when Lech Wałęsa makes his kind of appearance as this figurehead, kind of charismatic, working class figure who speaks sort of grammatically incorrect Polish and was able to sort of bring the normal people along with him and as intellectuals within the opposition movement. And yeah, at the end of August, these famous agreements are signed, which allows the trade union, Solidarity Trade Union, to operate the first legal trade union within the former Soviet bloc. And yeah, you get 13 months or whatever it is it 13? 14 months of this kind of sort of independent, almost side by side with the authorities. It's sort of like almost like secondary authorities, which had popular legitimacy next to the Polish government, which by that point, well, it never really had that much legitimacy, but by 1980, it had very, very little. And this sort of uneasy sort of truce continued for, 13 or 14 months until martial law in December 1981. That's my very short overview.
So would you say in general, the socio-political context was different from the 1974 and 1978 era as we come to 1981-82?
Definitely 74. I think at 74, you've got Gierek in charge and things. I think Polish society is, I suppose, riding a bit of a crest of a wave, perhaps about to start to, I won't say collapse at that point, but it certainly start this descent. 78, I think things are kicking off a little bit more, but obviously the introduction of martial law is a whole another level to sort of where we were in 78.
Poland has now qualified to 3 straight World Cups, and that in itself was an achievement. But how did they view their chances at this point?
I think the introduction of martial law perhaps had a bit of a dampener on that. Some people weren't even they weren't even thinking about football at the time. I suppose there was too much going on in daily life, but especially with the fact that all of a sudden nobody wanted to come to Poland. I think they had a friendly match scheduled with Belgium, who suddenly decided we don't want to come to what we consider a war zone.
In fact, that was one of my questions. I was surprised that there were no preparation friendly matches in the year 1982. They're all against club sides. Was this the reason?
Yeah, this is the reason entirely. So after qualification was assured, they had a friendly match in Argentina, which is all sorts of bonkers, going back to Młynarczyk as well. The fact that all of a sudden Poland went to this friendly match without any fit goalkeepers. I think you had Piotr Mowlik, whose father had died, Jacek Kazimierski, who I think got picked up an injury a few days before the game, and Młynarczyk, who had also injured his finger a few days before the game, training for Widzew, to the point where Tomaszewski said he was going to join the team in Madrid on a stopover to Argentina and didn't show up. And Młynarczyk, who had a finger injury at the time, the coaches basically got him onto the plane to basically say, we need to maintain an element of normality. We can't turn up to Argentina without a goalkeeper. But he sort of arrived thinking that Tomaszewski would be playing the game, and it turned out that Tomaszewski had no intention of turning up. And Młynarczyk actually played the game against Argentina with a broken finger. And by all accounts, numerous painkilling injections and lots of alcohol on the flight, if some of the stories are to be believed. So that was I think it was a very successful game for Poland, who beat Argentina. And then they had a defeat against Spain. But then, after that, the introduction of martial law meant that nobody wanted to play against Poland. And to be honest, there was a point where nobody actually knew if Poland would be able to play any games or even travel to the World Cup at that point.
Yeah, it completely changed the build-up to the World Cup. It's a very, very, very odd period of time. Poland is a pariah internationally. Diplomatically, the Polish state is finding it almost impossible to communicate with other countries. Sanctions are being imposed on them from the US. So it's a very strange time. And they couldn't find anyone to play. So they're playing all these friendly games. And definitely not the ideal build-up to the World Cup.
I mean, you look at some of the opposition that they were playing against. I've got a big list of this, and I think that starting at their first friendly game, it was against FC Modena in Italy. They played against AS Roma. They played against a representative team from Milan, so a team of combined players from Inter and AC who were
I remember that one.
Italian internationals. Then they played some games in Spain, Celta Vigo, Athletic Bilbao. They played some games in France and Germany, so Stade Rennes, Racing Club Lens. They played a team from a small village somewhere, Hagenau, on the border with Germany, Mulhouse, VfR Aalen, and then finished it off against Stuttgart. So it was a hefty mix of opposition, and a bit, I suppose, a bit chaotic, but all with the intention of trying to get as much game time behind them as possible.
I guess these days Poland would have been kicked out, really. If you think about it, compared to, let's not go into modern day geopolitics too much, but it has happened before, and in some respects you could have seen that them being kicked out. I mean, they weren't invaded, but they were. I suppose the 78 World Cup was in Argentina, wasn't it? So, anyway, less said about that, the better.
Let's look at the final 22 selected for the World Cup by Anton Pietnicek. At number 1, starting goalkeeper, Józef Młynarczyk of Widzew Łódź. Backup goalkeepers, number 21, Jacek Kazimierski of Legia Warsaw, and number 22, Piotr Mowlik of Lech Poznan. Like in our previous podcast, I apologize for any mispronunciation of any Polish names. For defenders, at number 2, we have Marek Zuba of LKS Lodz. Number 3, Janusz Kupczewicz of Arka Gdynia. Number 4, Tadeusz Dolny of Górnik Zabrze. Number 5, Paweł Janas of Legia Warsaw. Number 9, Władysław Zmuda, captain of a team from Widzew Łódź. Number 10, Stefan Majewski of Legia Warsaw. Number 12, Roman Wojcicki of Slask Wrocław. Number 14, Andrzej Palaj of Górnik Zabrze. Midfielders, number 6, Piotr Skrobowski of Wisla Krakow. Number 7, Jan Jalocha of Wisla Krakow. Number 8, Waldemar Matijic of Górnik Zabrze. Number 13, Andrzej Bunkol of Legia Warsaw. Number 15, Włodzimierz Ciolek of Stal Mielec. Number 18, Marek Kusto of Legia Warsaw. And number 20, Zbigniew Boniek of Widzio Lodz. Strikers, number 11, we have Włodzimierz Smolarek of Widzio Lodz. Number 16, Grzegorz Lato, playing in Lokeren in Belgium. Number 17, Andrzej Jarmach, playing in Auxerre in France. And number 19, Andrzej Ivan of Wisla Krakow. From this group, Zmuda, Lato, Jarmach, and Kusto were in the 1974 and 1978 squads, while Kupchevich, Wojcicki, Ivan, and Boniek were part of the 1978 squad. We come to the World Cup. Poland are in the first group with Italy, Cameroon, and Peru. So on paper, it looks like it'll be Italy and Poland who would qualify from this group. They start their first match on June 14th at Vigo against future World Cup champions Italy. For this match that ends in a scoreless tie, we have the following lineup. Mlynarczyk, Janas, Jalocha, Zmuda, the captain, Majewski, Matizik, Ivan, he'd be replaced by Kusto in the 72nd minute, Bunkol, Lato, Smolarek, Boniek. And in this match, Boniek would be booked in the 10th minute, which would be important as we come to the semi-final against the same opponents. The first match, scoreless tie, I think that it was expected that maybe the sides would tie and maybe divide and conquer the rest of the teams in this group. But in the second match against Cameroon, Poland discovered that Cameroon were a whole different proposition. This is a Cameroon side with the likes of Thomas Nkono in goal and Roger Mia and others like Tofel Abega, managed by the Frenchman Jean Vincent from the French team of the 1958 World Cup. So this match on June 19th at La Coruña, this match also ends as a scoreless tie. For this match, you have Mlynarczyk, Janas, Jalocha, Zmuda, Majewski, Smolarek, Boniek, Bunkol, Lato, Palaj, he'd be replaced by Kusto in the 67th minute, and Ivan, and he'd be replaced by Jarmach in the 72nd minute. So 2 matches, 2 ties. It was a very tight group. Italy also had tied its first 2 matches.
The Polish press, just to add, were very, very critical of Poland after the Cameroon game. And there was a serious kind of negative environment around the team. Thought I'd just add that little thing in there before we move on.
I think to jump in as well, there was a lot of uncertainty and chaos around. A lot of things happened during those first 2 games as well. You mentioned Boniek's yellow card. I mean, I was watching the game back a few weeks ago, and it's the tiniest thing. It was the fact that he was defending a free kick, and he stood on the end of the wall, and the wall just hasn't gone back far enough. And he's the closest player to the referee, and he gets the yellow card. He did the same to an Italian player as well, to be fair, but it's the referee trying to assert his authority. And like you said, when it comes to later in the tournament, that's just that small thing. If it wasn't Boniek at the end of the wall, if it was, I don't know, someone completely different, it's perhaps a different story for Poland's tournament. You've got injuries there as well that we've not mentioned. Before the tournament, we've got Piotr Skrobowski's injury. He turns up to the World Cup with a broken leg. The players apparently convince Pietnicek not to send him home because he's here now, and whoever you're going to replace him with is probably on a beach somewhere.
I think Andrzej Ivan's book, he talks about Skrobowski just sitting around at the pool drinking cervezas, basically. A very strange story, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then you mentioned Andrzej Ivan as well. Second game. Well, the first game he comes off with an injury as well. You mentioned he's been substituted, but the second game he tears all of his muscle in his leg, and he's ruled out for the rest of the tournament.
He was sitting around at the pool with the beers as well. But I think Skrobowski, both of them together, yeah.
Well, it's Skrobowski, but then we go on to the next game. You've got Skrobowski and you've got Ivan, the two Wisła Kraków players, and you go into the third game, and we're just about to mention it, and I suppose this segues a nice for you, Sean, but you've got Jan Jelocha as well, who, one of the worst injuries I can think of in football, from what I've heard, it's exploded testicle, which is, he's ruled out for the rest of the tournament as well. So the three Wisła Kraków players all ruled out through injury.
And I suppose we didn't really mention Ivan before. Obviously, he was there in 78 as well, I think, Ivan.
Yeah.
But hardly did he play at all in the 78 World Cup?
He played a small part, I think.
Yeah, but I mean, Ivan was another very good player. I mean, not a superb player, but I mean, the reason why Ivan is, obviously, he's now dead, unfortunately. But the reason why Ivan is so crucial is because he wrote a fantastic autobiography. Well, a journalist wrote it for him, but with an incredible amount of anecdotes, not just about the Polish national team, but also about the Polish league and corruption scandals and all these kind of different things. One of those players that from outside you wouldn't consider him to be so interesting, but really someone who's almost like central to a lot of the stories around those games.
The third game, the final game in this group, is against Peru, who they defeated in the 1978 World Cup. Some of the same familiar names: Ramon Quiroga in goal, Cubillas, among others, Oblitas, Uribe. For this match, we have the following lineup for Poland. This match is at La Coruña. So we have Mlinarczyk, Janas, Jelocha, who you mentioned, who would have his injury in the 26th minute and be replaced by Dzuba, Zmuda, Majewski, Matizi, Kupchevich, Bunkol, Lato, Smolarek. He'd be replaced by Ciolek, who I think with his first touch scored Poland's fifth goal, and Zbigniew Boniek. The first half is again scoreless, but Poland, wearing all red, comes to life in the second half. So in the 55th minute, Kupchevich robbed the ball on the left side and he sends Smolarek through to score. A few minutes later, in the 58th minute, on the right side, there's a long cross from a Polish defense, I think from Dzuba, and Boniek is in the middle, and he immediately heads it to the right to the onrushing Lato, who shot ground-level shot from outside of the box. Just a few minutes later, after that, in the 61st minute, Bunkol's cross from the right side was struck in by Boniek. In the 69th minute, there's a combination play on the left side, and Boniek backheeled to Bunkol to shot past Quiroga. In the 76th minute, Lato crossed from the right side and Ciolek struck. I believe that this was his first touch of the tournament, in fact. Peru pulls a goal back in the 83rd minute through La Rosa. Poland came to life just in time and won convincingly to advance to the second round.
Just in time there. You know, there's stories that all of the Polish officials with the team, all of the senior officials were all ready to go home. They were all had their suitcases packed with exotic fruits that you couldn't find in Poland, oranges and that sort of thing, all ready to go home and sell some of the exotic fruit to their friends and family that they don't get very often. And all of a sudden they're through to the next round, to the point where I believe they hadn't paid for their hotel reservations for the next round. So they had a hotel booked in Barcelona, or provisionally booked, and by the time they come to take their hotel, it's already been snapped up by the Argentina team. So they have to go and find alternative accommodation somewhere.
It could have been also linked to them being cheapskates at the time as well. That they, I mean, the severe economic crisis plus then martial law, sort of that. Yeah, not very well organized, right?
No, not very well organized at all. And, you know, that goes back. They had issues with their training center earlier in the tournament as well. They had to move their training base as well. But yeah, effectively, they find a nice little hotel up in the mountains somewhere. No air conditioning, which in the summer heat, you know, it's bad enough here and it's 30 degrees in Leicester at the moment. But in the middle of the Spanish summer, no air conditioning, that can have huge problems. And there's going into the second round games against Belgium and the Soviet Union, which we're about to mention, you've got reports of Boniek, the team's star, he's falling ill. He's got a bit of a high temperature and he's really struggling. And then obviously we go on to the next game, which is Belgium.
I just wanted to just quickly go back to that game, the 5-1, because first of all, obviously Poland did play fantastic in the second half. But second of all, this is if you're going to tell this kind of narrative story of the World Cup, right? It's like, very slow games, the two first games, and then everything exploded to life. I think there's this very good film, right? The Mundial Graf Wszystko, I don't know how they translate it into English, this film that was released in 2012 about it. And it's the time when all the music plays and, because it exploded and there was nothing really happening in the first couple of games. Well, there was things happening, but not very much on the pitch in terms of Poland playing well.
For the second round, they're in a group with Belgium and the Soviet Union. And the matches are played at Barcelona at the Nou Camp Stadium. The first match is against, in fact, today's the anniversary. It's on June 28th, 1982 against Belgium. This is the Belgium, some familiar names: Walter Muse, Ludo Kuk, Verkouteren, Jan Sulemans, and their own Polish player, Alex Czerniatinski. For this match, we have the following lineup: Mlinarczyk, Janasz, Juba, Zmuda, captain of the team, Majewski, Maticic, Kupchevich, he'd be replaced by Cholek in the 82nd minute, Bunkol, Lato, Boniek, and Smolarek. This match is forever remembered for Zbigniew Boniek's hat trick. So, in the 3rd minute, Lato passed from the right side to near the edge of the box, and Boniek just blasted it to the roof of the net. In the 25th minute, from the right side, Kupchevich crossed to the left side, Bunkol headed it across, and Boniek in turn headed it just over Theo Kusters. In the second half, in the 54th minute, from the middle, Lato sent Boniek through, who goes, dribbles around Kuster, and scores. Poland win convincingly 3-0. So is Boniek's performance considered one of the greatest by any Polish player in a World Cup?
We don't have much video from Wilimowski in 38. No. So therefore, this is clearly by far the best individual performance at a World Cup by a Polish player. Yeah, it's amazing.
I completely agree. Like you said, Wilimowski would be the only one in 38 that comes close to it. Just as I mentioned before, Boniek went into this game with a fever. According to what he says, according to his diaries, he took a couple of aspirin, headed out onto the pitch, and blew the Belgian defence away. There's always this famous photo from the 82 World Cup of the Belgian defence and Maradona. And you see this one where there's about 7 Belgian defenders in a row, and you've got Maradona there on his own who's terrorising them. But I would argue that Boniek terrorised them more than Maradona did. His performance was just, another level.
That third goal is just
the third
goal. Superb. Fantastic. It's just brilliant because, I'm not criticizing you, Sean, but you didn't really do it entirely justice because it's a wonderful team move, right? Which just, and it fantastic ball over, and it's just a beautiful goal. I think it's, in my opinion, again, I don't know how you would rate these things because it's all so subjective, but I think one of the best team goals in a World Cup. I think just a beautiful goal. And the commentator, obviously, and the combination of 3 goals, right? Because you've got the really hard shot, the header, and then the beautiful team goal. It's just absolutely.
The header is one of my favorite goals. Just to get that to work, how it did is that long ball over the top to I think you said it's Bunsol, who then heads it back, and it's just a looped header from Boniek over Kusters in the goal. Yeah, it's just like you say, it's an all-round stunning performance.
It's also exhilarating, right? There's like joy involved in it, right? I wouldn't say it's Jogo Bonito because it's Poland and not Brazil, but it really is just a joyful performance. Yeah.
Well, in the meantime, the Soviet Union also defeated Belgium 1-0 a few days later. So going into this last match against the Soviet Union, having a better goal difference, only really needs to hold on to a tie to advance to the semifinals. So this match against the Soviet Union is on July 4th, again at Barcelona at Nou Camp. This match, we have the following lineup. Mlinarczyk, Janas, Zuba, Zmuda, Majewski, Bunchol, Lato, Matijic, Kupčević. He'd replaced by Ciolek in the 51st minute, Boniek, and Smolarek. Boniek would get a second yellow card in the 88th minute. I mean, the second in the tournament. He would be booked in the 88th minute, which would rule him out of the semifinals. Now, this match that ended as a scoreless tie, and Poland got the result they needed to advance. But obviously, this match is also mostly remembered for the solidarity protests in the stands. And I'm just wondering, how was this covered, was it covered at all in Poland, the protests in the stands?
There was an element, the plan was to cover it up. I think through the tournament, there have been small pockets of these protests, people in the stands with flags, and not necessarily Polish people. There were some Polish people who traveled to the tournament. That in itself is a big thing for a country that was in martial law at the time. But a lot of it was from foreigners who were supportive of the solidarity movement. But there were small pockets of people with maybe some red and white flags. The Polish press didn't cover it at all. The TV stations, it was a live feed from the Spanish host broadcaster. The Polish station back in Warsaw had buttons that they could press, which basically every time the ball went to a certain end of the pitch where the big solidarity banners were, it basically cut the feed or showed pictures of fans celebrating in the stands, completely different games.
Didn't they have a delay or something like that? So they gave them a little bit more time as well. So they had it on like 15 and 20-second delay, so they were allowed to press the button. Mm-hmm.
But there was no coverage of that side of it in Poland at all. Obviously, everywhere else, it was a big thing. I think you mentioned Mundial Grau of Gisco, the film. I think there's one guy on that who was actually involved in the protest, the French guy, who says that, there were newspaper headlines the next day. It was, Poland 0, Soviet Union 0, Solidarity 1, Russia 0, or something like that. It was that big of a thing for them to have these protests in the stand. But back in Poland, there was no coverage of it at all.
Yeah, for people like Boniek and a couple of others, even though Boniek didn't really strongly engage in political activities, no one really did apart from Terlecki, who's, we talked about him before. I don't think they had anything against the Soviet players per se. I think they respected them, but I think it was an important game for them, and not just in terms of the World Cup, but in terms of it was against the Soviet Union, and they knew it was happening back home as well.
There was symbolism. I think Lato says that the players before the game, they received a telegram from Warsaw that basically just had the 3 words: "Musicie, musicie, musicie." You have to win. You have to win. You have to do it. It meant that much. And after the game, Poland qualified. I remember reading something about Lobanovsky, who was a coach for the Soviet Union at the time. Meant just as much to them as it did, but to the point where I've got a quote here. It was something like they had a choice. It was either to risk losing going forward or to play a safe bet and maybe get a draw. It may have knocked them out of the tournament, but losing to Poland would have been a disgrace for the Soviet Union, whereas a draw was acceptable. They just didn't want to lose that game. And I suppose for Poland, it was they had to win. They had to win, and they didn't get the win, but it was effectively a winning draw. They knocked the Soviet Union out of the tournament.
In the meantime, Italy has defeated Brazil 3-2 and are picking up form at the right time. And it's true, they met one another in the first match of the World Cup, but both teams had radically changed since the beginning of the tournament. Both had improved, but obviously Italy was at a different level at this point. And plus, Boniek was suspended for this semifinal against Italy.
It's Boniek.
So did that by itself made Poland lose any confidence? Would they resign to defeat, you think, before this match?
I don't necessarily think they were resigned to defeat. But by all accounts, that progressing past the Soviet Union was almost like the big victory for them. They perhaps celebrated a little too hard and perhaps took their eye off the prize a little bit.
They didn't expect to get so far with all the background and all that stuff. So I think that there was a bit of a, I suppose, a kind of a drop in adrenaline after the Soviet game, maybe, Ryan? Would you agree?
I think so. I don't think Boniek's absence as a whole was the downfall for Poland. But yeah, I think it was perhaps, like I say, I think they got that big win, I say win in inverted commas, against the Soviet Union. And then all of a sudden, I'm not saying it's not important, but it's going to be hard to top that, whatever, because it meant so much to everybody and everybody back home as well. So perhaps they didn't go into the game against Italy as strong as they perhaps could have gone.
Sometimes you call it like a free hit, as in, it's like they didn't really, maybe they didn't, it's not like they didn't believe in themselves, but I think they already were quite satisfied with what they'd achieved, and it would have been great if they'd have got through, but I don't think it was, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but that's the way I see it.
Yeah, and I think you've got the whole thing as well. And, we get to the point here, we have to mention Andrzej Sharma. Everybody thought that with Boniek, by this point, Boniek had started in midfield, and then for the Peru game, he'd been moved as effectively an attacker. Everybody has sort of assumed that with Boniek out, Sharmak would be the one to replace him. Sharmak, okay, he was in his 30s now, but he'd still been firing goals in France, and he'd scored goals against Italy in 74, I think, in games after that as well. So there was always an element of, I think, that they believed that the Italians were a bit nervous around Sharma. And it sort of seemed like he would be the first choice player to fill his boots. And Pietnicek chose to go with another option. There's all talk around why that was and whether Pietnicek made the right decision. But I think he went with Pałasz instead, I think. Andrzej Pałasz.
No, sure.
It's a weird choice, because Sharmak had so much experience as well. I mean, it is a weird choice.
This semi-final is on July 8th at Barcelona at Nou Camp. We have the following lineup for Poland: Mlynarczyk, Janasz, Zuba, Zmuda, captain of a team, Majewski, Bunchol, Lato, Matizik, Kupchevich, Cholek playing in the place of the suspended Boniek. He'd replaced by Pałasz in the second half in the 46th minute. Smolarek, and he'd replaced by Marek Kusto in the 78th minute. So this match, Italy wins 2-0. Paolo Rossi scores both goals, and they advance to the final, which they would win by defeating West Germany. And Poland would have to play in the third place match against France.
I suppose it was a bit of an anticlimax, and it was a bit of a Poland limped out of the tournament. Like I say, it was, Boniek's absence was obviously felt, but, a lot of people do think that, had Sharmak been in that team, had he been an option to replace Cholek instead of Pałasz, maybe things would have worked out differently. Alas, it wasn't to be.
The third place match is only 2 days later, on July 10th at Alicante. And they play a French team that also dramatically lost in the semifinal against West Germany after a 3-3 tie and a penalty kick shootout. And to be fair, for this match, they rested some of their starters and played with a number of players who may not have seen some action up to that point. Smolarek is suspended from this match, and that's when we'll see Jarmach start for the first time. And in fact, it's his final match for Poland, his 61st cap, and amazing, 61 caps and 32 goals. His first cap had been in 1973, and he would also score in this match. So for this match, we have the following lineup: Mlynarczyk, Janasz, Zuba, Zmuda, captain of a team, Majewski, Bunchol, Lato, Matizik, he'd be replaced by Wojcicki in the 46th minute, Kupchevich, Boniek, and Jarmach. France takes the lead in the 13th minute with a long-range ground level shot from René Girard. But Poland storms back on either side at the halftime. So in the 41st minute, from the middle, Boniek lobbed a pass to the left side, and from a narrow angle, Jarmach Validin his final goal for Poland. A few minutes later, in the 44th minute, Kupchevich took a corner kick from the left side, and that was headed in by Majewski. Right after halftime, in the 46th minute, Kupchevich scored with a free kick that deceived the French goalkeeper. It was on his near post. And France pulled a goal back in the 73rd minute through Alain Curiol, but Poland hold on and finished third for the second World Cup in 3. So that also finished third in 1974. With all the problems in the background, how significant of an achievement was finishing third? Even though I imagine it was not as magnificent as the 74 achievement, I still think it was probably seen as a significant achievement to finish third in a World Cup and win the bronze.
Definitely so. With the situation in Poland at the time, nobody expected where they were, especially after the 78 World Cup, the disaster that the 78 World Cup ended in. Chris mentioned a free hit. This tournament was a bit of a free hit. Nobody expected to do what they did. To get to where they did was amazing, but it always feels like it should have been more. It always feels like that Italy game, it just deflated everybody. They returned to Poland as heroes, just as much as the 74 team did. But it was always, what if Schumacher had played? What if Boniek had not been suspended? It feels like that 74 team was arguably the better team, but this one came closest to winning the World Cup.
I mean, it's difficult to, if you compare the two, the 74 and the 82 team, I think that, in my opinion, I think the 74 team was quite a lot better, but difficult to compare. But I think that the difference in the 74 and 82 is that the last game was a disappointment in 82. And in 74, it was a disappointment, but Poland pushed West Germany hard. And it was a game where there was a lot of tension, a lot of kind of adrenaline around it. And the game in the 82 World Cup really was the Soviet game. So it happened before. So it felt like in 82, they went out with a whimper. And I wouldn't say it was a bang in 74, but it felt like the tension continued right up to the end when they got knocked out. So that's why I would say 74 was a bit better in that regard. Although 82 was, incredible success still. Yeah.
I think as well there were problems in the squad. You mentioned Sharma, it being his last game. He maintains in his book that he didn't know it was his last game until Pietnicek said it. Pietnicek, who said that it was his last game and he wouldn't be picking him again, and he was only brought to the tournament for what he'd done for Polish football, and whether that's true or not, I think Pietnicek probably would argue that he said that. It just feels like a bit of a really disappointing end to the tournament, even though they won. There's all this talk about the fact that Zmuda had to hand out the medals to the team rather than being, presented with their medals. And there's an element of that a lot of people thought it was to do with the fact that it was a protest against martial law and that nobody was going to present them the medals. But I believe that isn't exactly the case from what I've read. Just the tournament ended as a bit of a whimper, and that was the right way to put it, Chris, I think.
You go back to Sharmak, didn't he? When he scored, he made a real symbol. He put his arm up, and it was sort of like
he didn't really react.
Check, look,
it was just a stern look on his face, and it was a stunning goal. It was a stunning goal from a brilliant angle, but it was just this almost defiance towards Pietnicek almost when he scored that goal. It was a stern face. Everybody came up to celebrate him, but there was barely a smile, not even a smile on his face, and it was just almost a stare at Pietnicek to say, "That's what I can do. That's what I could have done." Yeah. And yeah, it's those small decisions which have obviously had a massive impact on Poland's tournament.
Boniek would finish third in the Ballon d'Or at the end of the year behind Paolo Rossi and Alain Giresse, and would also join Juventus and be teammates with many of the World Cup winners that year. Was he clearly regarded as the greatest Polish player in history at that point in time?
That's a contentious one. It was always him or Dana. And arguably, you stick Lewandowski in amongst them now, but it's still the case. If you look back in history, it's Boniek or Dana.
I think that Boniek, they're just very different kinds of players, Boniek and Dana, right? So I would say that probably Boniek had more of an impact, but on the team, and therefore, but then it's really difficult.
You go back to the 74 team, and it's not all about Dana as such. It's about the whole team. Whereas 82, it's okay, there is an element of teamwork, but it's always remember for Boniek's performance against Belgium. It's the fact that they moved Boniek to an attacking position against Peru, which almost changed their fate. And it's almost that the team was built around Boniek. So to that extent, yes, you would argue that Boniek is probably the greatest player in Polish football at that point.
If you're going purely on performances at great tournaments, right? So I think that in that regard, but again, there's also a problem is that there's more footage of Boniek, and with Dana, it's quite difficult to. I mean, it's definitely locked away somewhere in Polish television headquarters, some of the games and stuff, but it's pretty difficult to get hold of it. Whereas with Boniek, obviously, then going on to be such an amazing player, well, very, very good player, let's say, Bella Denotta, right, at Juventus. Boniek was certainly more of a superstar than Dana, and that's also because of the time and the fact that he was able to go earlier and all those different things. So probably Boniek over Dana, I would think. But it's totally so subjective. It's so subjective. It really is.
It would be the end of the road for Lato and Jarmak, who would soon bow out. Lato and Jarmak would have contrasting fortunes in this World Cup. Obviously, Lato would still be part of a team, while Jarmak was restricted mostly to the bench. Surprisingly, he would still have a good goal-scoring record in France when he was playing with Auxerre for the number of years after this. They had been the symbols of this Poland team from 1974, 78, and now 82. So what can you say about the impact of these two in the overall 3 World Cups they participated in?
Well, clearly Lato, you would say, had the bigger impact, and that's purely because of what we've mentioned about Sharmak in the 82 World Cup. People disregard the 78 World Cup to a certain extent because obviously it wasn't a success, so nobody particularly came out of that tournament with glowing reviews. Obviously, both had a massive impact in 74. And Lato obviously was the top scorer, and Sharmak wasn't far behind him. But yeah, certainly in 82, Sharmak had very little impact. And I wouldn't say Lato was stunning, like Chris mentioned earlier. He's in his 30s at this point. He's losing his key attributes, his pace and his hair.
There was a couple of nice moments of Lato in the tournament, which were, I can't remember the individual moments, but he was definitely involved in some of the goals, and he still had that little acceleration at sort of key moments, which made him, that was really who he was as a player. But clearly, Lato had a bigger impact. I completely agree with Ryan over the 3 tournaments. But they were good friends as well, Lato and Sharmak. So,
Oleg and Oleg.
I think it was in Sharmak's autobiography where he was, I think I mentioned this in the 78 one, that they were just making fun. They were drawing. Mark got them to sort of do little psychological sort of pictures, and they were just doing like silly doodles of like them sitting in front of houses drinking beer or whatever. So they were also good friends as well as being key players in those 3 tournaments. Oh, not in 82. Sharmak wasn't important in 82 that much, but yeah.
In a way, this would be the reference point when Poland started to fade at the international level, despite qualifying for the 1986 World Cup. Why do you think this was?
I think, like you say, you've got some of those key linchpins like Lato, who has obviously left the team by that point. Boniek and Żmuda have obviously moved abroad. both moved to Italy by that point. I think I want to say Majewski's moved abroad at that point. International football, particularly, it happens in cycles, and that's the natural conclusion to Poland's cycle. You've got the societal impacts that are going on in the background. Poland is very much changing. Players and citizens are moving abroad in their droves. They're trying to, leave the country, and all of it. It's almost like that. I won't say the patriotism, but that attachment to Poland as a whole. People's attachment to it is perhaps changing slightly.
The country's also falling apart by the mid-80s. I mean, you've had 10 years of economic crisis and solidarity, martial law, and it's basically, I mean, it's also easier to move abroad because they sort of loosen things a little bit by the when they come out of martial law and stuff. So, I mean, in 86, they still had a couple of decent players there, and you've got new players, some not really new, but like Jekanovski coming through and stuff. But the 86 team, it's not a bad team. I mean, and Boniek's also in 86 is already, I think, 30. I think it generally was the end of a cycle. I think that the Lato and Sharmak leaving was sort of a key element of that, I think.
The start of the decline, really.
Yeah.
So in closing, what is the legacy of this 1982 World Cup for Polish football history and culture?
The legacy is I think that often people can count those 8 years together in a way. So I wouldn't say that the 82 one it obviously did have its own elements with solidarity and all that, the martial law element and stuff. But I think that it's linked together. 74, 78 and 82 are really linked together, and I don't think it stands out. I think also people look back, obviously it's a long time ago now, still to the 73 thing with Tomaszewski and the clown stuff in England and the first World Cup. So I'm not sure if it has a really, that's my opinion. I'm not sure if it has a really long-lasting legacy, specifically that World Cup. I think that 8 years does. That's my answer, yeah.
I would agree to an extent. I think both of those tournaments, the 74 and the 82 tournaments, were Poland sort of, not necessarily being underdogs, particularly in the 82 tournament, but sort of battling against adversity, I suppose. In 74 one, it was they were effectively considered nobodies, shall we say. I know they'd beaten England and they won the Olympic tournament, but obviously at that point the Olympic tournament was amateur, and around the rest of the world perhaps it wasn't seen as being that important. So for Poland, they came through as really nobodies and sort of were battling against these massive teams that had these massive histories. The 82 tournament, it was similar, but obviously more coming from a point of, they're battling against what was going on back home. And nobody was really expecting anything from them because of perhaps what happened in 78, but also what was happening at home, and the fact that they hadn't played any matches before the tournament of any real note, and hadn't particularly had a strenuous qualifying campaign. So again, not many people were perhaps expecting a lot from them, and perhaps a lot of people were expecting things at home as well. So from my point of view, the legacy of the 82 team is it's always set against what was happening back at home. That's the only real lens to view it.
Well, and also just Boniek being amazing is the other big thing. That was the one which became a world star really at that tournament.
And arguably the first real Polish world-class star.
Yeah.
Dana perhaps in 74, he was in contention. I think he finished high up in the Ballon d'Or, I want to say, or certainly high up in the tournament's best players.
I think he was third.
Yeah. But wasn't really a superstar as such. Whereas Boniek, it was, he was the first big, I suppose, modern Polish star. I say modern, he was well known in the press, he was well known abroad, and yeah.
I don't remember, Ryan. I'm not sure if it was against, there's also this kind of visual element of it as well, right? There's obviously in the 80s later on, he became really good friends with Platini, and there's all those photos of him and Platini constantly together, which I used to share on my with Twitter, now at X, obviously. But also, I think after the Soviet Union game, he exchanged shirts with the Soviet, I can't remember.
It was Baltasha, Sergei Baltasha.
Yeah, and he came and he went out onto Polish television, and he's sitting there in this Soviet shirt in front of the Polish TV cameras. And Boniek had such a cheek as well. He was a cheeky guy, and I think that he was sort of born almost to be a star in that regard. Whereas Dana was mild-mannered, didn't say very much, quite quiet, and Boniek
very reserved.
Boniek is not a quiet person. Let's just say.
And in that way, I think, and that's what I think I'm referring to when I say modern. That's the sort of what you expect from a footballer now. You expect them to be quite brash and quite open and quite loud and quite talkative and perhaps media trained and very talkative. And like I say, Boniek was perhaps the first Polish player to be like that.
And he fit into it really naturally. I mean, he just, he likes nice clothes, and he would, wear his sunglasses and stuff, and, all that kind of, 80s jeans, sort of Lash fashion kind of thing. He was in his element and didn't seem to have that many sort of private demons, whereas Dana obviously had a lot of kind of private demons in the background. So, yeah, I think that is Boniek's, that would be the legacy, and also, as Ryan said so well, the background, the socio-political background, which you can't really remove it from.
With that, I would like to thank both of you for your participation in this interview. And all our respective contact information is listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So thank you once again to both of you, and hope to continue these discussions on Polish football history.
We should do the 86.
For sure.
I mean, it wasn't an amazing tournament, but
I'm already thinking about it.
Some interesting stories as part of that as well. But yeah, thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
No, thank you.